Hello, gathered friends. I'm Horror Nuva, and welcome to another Bionicle Deep Dive. Today, I wanted to talk about a personal headcanon that I've been cooking up for a little while now. It sort of straddles the line between a theory and just straight up fan fiction, because while it's mostly canon consistent, it's also definitely non canon and kind of breaks from it at distinct points. It's about the three legendary masks from G1 and connecting them to the reformation of Spherus Magna in a way that I personally find satisfying and fixes some of the issues I had with the lore. The crux of my headcanon is this: the shattering and the explosion of energized protodermis caused a massive loss of life, a loss of creativity, and a disconnect from time for the people of Spherus Magna. And the three legendary masks were all meant to be a part of the healing process for reforming Spherus Magna, and to bring those things back to the planet. Energized protodermis is literally just liquid destiny, and from a philosophical perspective, you could argue that life, time, and creation are all important components of destiny. So perhaps the destructive explosion removed the planet from its destiny, and these masks were needed to reconnect and heal it. Now, part of this is already canon, as the Mask of Life was used by Matsunui to finish repairing the planet, by filling it with life and recreating its ecosystems. But what about the other two? What if all the masks were meant to be used to restore the planet by essentially returning their powers to it? Well, the Mask of Creation can fit in this headcanon quite nicely. It was stated that after the shattering, the Yugori actually lost the ability to make new things, to create. They could repair old stuff, but they no longer made anything new. The Mask of Creation could then be used to bring creativity back to the planet and to the people, something that the great beings would obviously want, considering how important creation was to them. Now, the final piece to this is the Mask of Time, and I'll admit, this is the biggest stretch in my headcanon. Like, it's a reach. But I do believe that it can fit somewhat, especially since it can actually be used to fix a small issue that I had with the Glatorian and Agori, which was how absurdly long their lifespans are. Most of the Bear Magna characters we see were around 100,000 years ago, before Matsunui went on his mission. Before this, 100,000 years ago was seen as the most ancient of ancient times, and the beings that were that old, like Helrix, Trenkrom, and Artaka, had an almost otherworldly vibe, even compared to other really old characters. There was a mystique and reverence to it, I felt, and I thought that having almost everyone we meet on Barra Magna just casually be older than the most ancient beings in the Matorn universe somewhat cheapened the mystique and atmosphere surrounding them. Not completely, but it did feel genuinely odd to have these naturally occurring organic beings live for some estimates up to 265,000 years, with no explanation or even abnormality about it. Especially since otherwise the Agori were completely non magical, and meant to feel more like normal people compared to the Matoran. The MU inhabitants I was okay with because they were biomechanical and made to be somewhat mystical, and it would make sense for them to live at least as long as Matsunui's mission would take. Maybe I would have been more okay with it if the Agori and their history and some of their biology were explored a little bit more in the story, but they never really got around to it. One blog on Tumblr that I follow, Rebuilt Bionicle, shout out to them and their blog for being a really cool alternate universe that goes into a lot of very cool detail. Who is developing their own alternate universe world building, solves this by shortening the time span to about 5,000 years instead of 100,000 years, and also making it so that all the Barra Magna characters were born after the Shattering. And while this does kind of work as a solution, I also think that the fact that many of them were around for the Core War and the Shattering was an important part of their characters, and would weaken their arcs to remove that. Especially Akar, who numerous times throughout the story is shown actually dealing with PTSD from the war all those years ago. So what we want is to somehow finagle a way to have them be around for those events, but also not make the passage of 100,000 years feel cheap. This is where the Mask of Time comes in. Now, the way I would have it is that the explosion of energized protodermis from the Shattering also disconnected them and perhaps the whole planet from the flow of time, Samurai Jack style. For those unfamiliar, Samurai Jack was a cartoon where the titular character was flung thousands of years into the future by a demon, and he has to find his way back to his own time. In season 5, it's revealed that he's been in the future for 50 years, but he hasn't aged at all because the time travel process disconnected him from the flow of time. He can no longer age, but he still can be killed. I propose that maybe something like this happened to the Baramagnans, and explain why those normal organic creatures lived to be so extremely long. This would also do a lot to explain why it's nothing really major happened on Barra Magna in those 100,000 years. I mean, it could just be that a lot did happen in Barra Magna over those 100,000 years, and the story just didn't focus on it, but it's never really talked about or implied, and it's shown that the Glatorian system was made not too long after the Shattering, or at least, as soon as they were able to set up the villages, and then they just kind of continued with that cycle of trying to survive for those 100,000 years. And while that certainly does paint the bleak picture that was so atmospheric for Barra Magna, it just feels, I don't know, it feels like more should have happened. You know, as far as we can tell, there were no major shifts in the larger global political landscape of the planet. It's like they were stuck in one time. Now, there was one major shifting of events. The invasion of the Skrull, which was prompted by them fleeing from the Batara, who awakened out of nowhere. And you could say, oh, this breaks your theory. But here's the thing. It can actually be used as massive support for my theory, and here's how. The Skrull fleeing from the north and arriving in Roxas is said to have happened about 1 year prior to the events of the 2009 story. You know what else happened around 1 year before that? Tahu Nuva using the Mask of Time during the Borak Kal arc. And we know for certain that the Vahi has the potential to affect time on a cosmic scale. That was the whole warning. And that even just using the mask sends out fluctuations in the flow of time. That's how Voparak tracks the mask. So what if Tahu using the mask against the Kal sent out ripples in time from the moon of Aqua Magna down to the planet of Barra Magna and sort of jostled the timeline and got some things moving a little bit. Enough for the Batra to activate after 100,000 years. That could be an explanation for why it seemed like nothing really happened, and then that last year a bunch of stuff happened. I think this headcanon adds a lot, mainly by adding new purpose to even having the legendary masks. I mean, the Mask of Life already had an explicit purpose for its existence, to resurrect Motunui in case he ever became ill, and also to kill the entire Matoran universe in case it became irredeemable. But there actually wasn't much purpose for having those other cosmic power level masks around. I mean, why would they need to have those masks that can cause changes on a planetary scale? Maybe it was because they were meant to be used to heal a planet. I also think it's interesting to think about how the origins of each individual mask might play into this. Mask of Creation, probably the mask with the least world-ending potential, was just made by the Great Beings and given to Artaka, who could reasonably be trusted to keep it safe and use it responsibly. The Mask of Life was very dangerous, but also potentially very necessary during Masunui's journey, given that it might be needed to save his life, so the Great Beings also made it ahead of time, but hid it and guarded it. The Mask of Time, also very, very world-endy, wasn't even made until comparatively recently, by Vakama, about 1,000 years ago. Now, the Great Discs were needed to make the mask were made very early on, but hidden and separated. This kind of makes sense. The mask was super dangerous if misused, but there wasn't actually a huge need for it during the journey. But if the pieces of it were made and legends about it written so that when the time came it could be made and used for some purpose, which in my mind is restoring the flow of time to Spherus Magna. Something interesting is that Vakama was asked to create the Vahi by Makuta as a part of his plan. We also know that Makuta's desire to take over the Great Spirit Robot was actually a misinterpretation of his own destiny to work with Motunui as two Great Spirit Robots to heal the planet. Perhaps his desire to possess the Mask of Time, in addition to his plans with the Matoran, were also him subconsciously knowing that the Vahi was needed to complete his destiny? I don't know. It is kind of interesting that he specifically asks the Mask of Time to be created right at around the same time Matanui would have been returning to Spherus Magna. Like, if you look at the timeline, Makuta sent Matanui to sleep basically just before he would have landed on Spherus Magna. He landed on Aqua Magna, which was orbiting. He was right there. So maybe he knew the timing was right because he knew that this was around the time that the Mask of Time was needed. It's just funny to think about, you know? And again, none of this is actually canon. I'm not claiming to have found some secret hidden meaning that Greg, the story team, put out there on purpose. But I am saying that the pieces are there to make a theory that I find satisfying, and maybe you will too. And what's more Bionicle, more Lego really, than taking pieces that were given and putting them together in a way that's cool and fun? But anyways, that's my theory on the masks of time, life, and creation. Let me know what you guys think. Do you like this theory, or would you prefer something else? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care.